Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Shiv Nadar Foundation Conversation Series. My name is Siddharth Mallavarapu, and I am a professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Shiv Nadar University. It's my pleasure to be moderating the seventh conversation today as part of the series with Ambassador Freddy Svane, the Danish ambassador to India, as part of this conversation series. At the outset, a few words about this conversation series. The conversation series is intended to provide a platform to bring to each of you inspiring accounts from distinguished figures from across various fields. It is the effort of the Shiv Nadar Foundation to communicate with wider audiences, students, faculty, colleagues, parents, alumni, partners, and all other listeners who are able to join us today. The intent is to really keep us positive in these challenging times and continue to partake of the best, even in these times of restricted mobility owing to the current global health crisis. Thank you all for tuning in. I would like now to introduce our special guest for this evening, Ambassador Svane. Ambassador Svane has had a long and distinguished career as a diplomat, having begun in 1982 when he entered the Danish Foreign Service. He has a law degree from the University of Copenhagen and has had an earlier stint to India from 2010 to 2015 when he was also ambassador to Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. He is currently on his second stint as ambassador to India. Welcome, Ambassador Svane. Thank you for consenting to be our guest on this conversation and sparing time to share your thoughts with our listeners. Without further ado, let me proceed to my opening question. Ambassador Svane, we're living in difficult times with the current global health crisis looming large. As a diplomat, what is your perspective on notions of community responsibility? How do you view the Indian effort in dealing with the current crisis? And in your assessment, are there different cultures of community responsibility across the world? Please go ahead, Ambassador Svane.
Thank you very much, Professor Siddharth. It's a great honor for me to address this esteemed group of students and scholars and so forth. It's always great to interact. Let me start outright with answering some of these very important questions. I think the way in which we have to deal with this kind of pandemic calls for what I call the DNA of each and every population. And of course, there are differences, and it does not only have to do where you are placed geographically, but also has to do with the culture, how big you are. Scale matters here really big time. Community responsibility is something that can be understood differently. In Denmark, it has different connotation, and in India, perhaps a different one, and so forth. But what is important is wherever we belong to, wherever we are living, then we have to develop what I call a kind of individual responsibility. We have to take care not only of ourselves, but also of our families, our friends, of our neighborhood. And of course, the culture in which you are a part will have an impact on how you react to some of these things. What I have learned from being posted as a diplomat in Asia for quite many years in India and in Japan is that in your cultures, individualism is not that highly regarded. It's much more about community, and you have to be part of community. That makes you stronger. In India, you have the family structures. It's a kind of community, and beyond that. In Denmark, for instance, we are very individualistic. So I'm the boss, or whether you are a boss or not does really not matter. So that is also important as to how we respond to this kind of pandemic. What I have learned about India is the following, that India is, I think I'll put it in the following way. When I came to India first time in 2010, I had never been to India. But it's the first time when I, together with my family, arrived at the posh new airport, Indira Gandhi International Airport in Delhi. Then I came out to what I call the Indian reality. That was not the fancy airport lounges and all that. There was reality with two-wheelers, dogs, or people and cars and so forth. But I also, a little bit later down the drain time-wise, I realized that my first impression of India being a country turned into India being a nation. And then when I left, I gave an interview to Doordarshan, and I said, from country to nation and then living civilization. So that is also part of the kind of way in which we respond to a pandemic like this. One of the most important takeaways, as I see it, from this pandemic, and luckily India has responded very, very smartly and cautiously, and I think you should be happy that your government and India as such reacted very, very cautiously, but also very, very early. But one of the most important takeaways is this growing community spirit, which I have seen, I've sensed, and I can see that whether you are extremely rich or extremely poor, people are helping, people are taking responsibility, and that's so important. So I think we, in our culture, in the European culture, we could learn a lot from how India and Indians are responding.
Okay, excellent. I want to also immediately dive into another fairly important contemporary issue which we're all contending with, I think, across countries, which is the climate change question. I know Denmark has a lot to offer in terms of renewable energy sources, and I think it's important to think about ways forward. Because quite clearly there is a crisis here. The Paris Climate Agreements is no longer what it once was, 2016, with the United States pulling out of it. So what is your sense? How are they missing institutions when it comes to climate change questions and how we can deal with it? What is the best way forward? What are your thoughts on this?
I don't think we lack institutions. I think we have all what we need here. But what we lack is perhaps what I call a kind of commitment, the individual personal commitment. Sorry, I just had to. So it was a telephone, sorry. So what is important here is responsibility once again. It's about individual responsibility. How do you cope with that? How do you take responsibility? It goes without saying that climate change is perhaps the biggest challenge of all challenges that we are facing. But having lived here in India for quite many years, being out and coming back, I realized that also looking into the pandemic, this is not a question of climate, because climate is only one part of what the broader nature. So nature is really what we have to deal with. Nature is not only climate, it's also pandemics, it's also floodings and whatever and whatnot. So in that context, I see a very strong demand, at least politically, to develop a commitment that we deal properly and respectfully with nature. And within nature, the kind of a broad concept of nature, you also need to look into what I call the human nature. So if we want to avoid further more pandemics, floodings, earthquakes, strange climate changes, then we have to react to these things. And I think we need to live in a kind of sync with nature. You rightly said, Professor, that Denmark has really done a lot with renewables, and it did not come out of nowhere. Back in the early 1970s, we were faced with a oil embargo. Our supply of oil from the Middle East suddenly was stopped, and from one day to another, and I was a child at that time, we could not get petrol or gas for our cars, our tractors. Everything stopped. The escalators, the elevators, and everything stopped. And then we realized that we could not really go on with that kind of dependence. So we developed or redefined an old traditional technology, the wind turbines. And today Denmark is world leading when it comes to wind. We call it a win-win situation in the sense that more than 45% of all electricity consumed last year in Denmark was generated from wind. 45% of electricity consumed. And we did something that we are trying really to cooperate with India about. Namely, we said you can easily develop your economy. So our economy grew to the double size, whereas the energy consumption stayed more or less stable. So we had kind of a curve that economy went up like this, and then the energy consumption stayed down there, stable. And in fact, the CO2 footprint went down. So you can develop an economy through renewables without really sacrificing your economy. And we think it's a recipe that India could and should look into.
Okay, excellent, to get a good sense of how you look at this particular question. I want to shift registers now, and I want to ask you about a particular figure in Denmark, Hans Christian Andersen, who is, of course, most well known for his fairy tales. These are popular across the world. Is there a particular favorite you have from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales or his other writings? I know he's written much more than fairy tales. And are there any political lessons or allegories we can draw from Hans Christian Andersen's work?
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, Hans Christian Andersen is not that well known in India, and I think that could easily be an introduction to common sense or human nature and so forth. And it's right, Professor Siddharth, when you're saying that he is kind of part of Denmark, Danish culture, and we can learn a lot from him. And we think, even today, and for many centuries, in fact, we thought that his fairy tales were for the kids and the children. But basically, the learnings from his fairy tales are much more addressed towards the adult. And we can learn a lot. My own fairy tale is perhaps it will not come as a surprise to you. This is the ugly duckling. Because my family name is Swan, or Hans in Hindi, and ugly duckling is a small little bird that doesn't know that he is becoming the white big bird. So I think in each and every culture you can learn a little bit from that. You might not be seen as somebody special. You're small, you're ugly, but then given the right kind of framework, given the right kind of driving forces, and perhaps you develop yourself these kind of personalities or traits, then you can become a big white bird. And the swan, the white bird, is in fact the national bird of Denmark. So I think in that context, we can learn a lot from Hans Christian Andersen. Another very important fairy tale is about the emperor without clothes. And many beliefs, I don't know whether it's true or not, but many politicians are often not mentioning names, not mentioning specific countries. But you have once in a while political leaders, you have business people, you have whatever, ambassadors perhaps, and they think they are in control of everything. They know everything about each and every subject and so forth. And then there might be a small kid standing when the parade is passing by and say, oh, this ambassador, he knows everything, but he has no clothes on. So I think at least this kind of fairy tale will tell a story. But since you mentioned Hans Christian Andersen, I would like to mention two other Danes who are much more popular and well-known in India. First and foremost, a guy called Haldor Topsøe, and he almost became 100 years. He passed away 4 days because before he could celebrate his 100th birthday. But he came to India very, very early in the 50s and the 60s, and he was instrumental in assisting India developing the Green Revolution, where the farmers got new technologies, fertilizers, and all that. And this kind of technology that he brought in really was a substantial part of the Green Revolution. So he met Indira Gandhi many, many, many times, and they still have a company out here The family foundation had a school, a big school in Sundarbans in the Marsh territories in the south of Kolkata. I've been there a number of times. The other person, which is very, very important, is a guy called Niels Bohr. And he got the Nobel Prize, and he was instrumental in developing nuclear power. And he was, in fact, the guy in the 50s and the 60s who brought the nuclear technology to India. Whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but I will leave it to others for that judgment. But he really did something that the Americans didn't like, and Haldor Topsøe likewise was also not liked by the Americans because they didn't want India to get these kind of technologies. But both of them helped in a tremendous way India developing farming and technology, energy supply, and so forth.
Right. Thank you. I also wanted to ask you about one accomplishment of Denmark which has made global headlines, which is the happiness index scale. So what is your conception of happiness? What can we take out from this particular indexing exercise, and how has Denmark fared so well on this particular scale? What is your assessment and reading of it?
Happiness is depending on how you ask questions and how you define happiness. Our very good friends and your neighbors in Bhutan, they have a gross national happiness index, and that's a different way of defining happiness. And I like that kind of model. But Denmark, we are a small, very rich country. We only have 6 million inhabitants, so we are just a small, tiny part of Delhi or Mumbai and so forth. But over centuries, Denmark and Danes developed a kind of political concept that we might disagree about X, Y, Z of things, but basically we shared the same vision that Danes should have a kind of basic framework allowing Danes to prosper. If you were without job, you didn't have any education, you would be treated. So some of the most important parts of this Danish happiness is that we have free education, we have free healthcare. So it is not based on how much money you have, how rich you are. You have the principle of equality being applied across that. And that's very, very important. Another thing which I often allude to when I give this kind of lectures is that in our schools, our youngsters, they are taught to ask questions. And if you ask questions, then you will know, you will get insights, you get knowledge. So when you get insights and knowledge, then you will have a kind of insight, and that can develop kind of curiosity. And if you know questions and answers, then you might develop a kind of community spirit. And often I do this. I hope you can all see. Yeah, that's a question mark. That's right. That's part of my kind of promotional activities. So you see, this is a question mark. So in our educational system, we are asking questions. Sorry, I have to take it away, because when you ask questions, as I said, then you develop kind of insights. And when you know how things are, then you get a heart. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can.
Question mark, and then you mirror it, because that represents also a kind of happiness. So schooling, what you do in the schools, in the educational system, is very, very important. Also to grow this kind of community responsibility and so forth.
I also wanted to follow up on this. You brought in education, and I'm happy you brought in education into this particular answer as well, which is there are lots of Indian students who also explore, studying in an international environment and context. And would be curious, I imagine, also to know more about what Denmark has an offer for students pursuing humanities, social sciences, the hard sciences, engineering, other disciplines. What are its real strengths, and what is attractive about the Danish educational system, higher educational system as well?
I think we have this kind of very liberal way of thinking out of the box. So education is not a kind of one-way street where a teacher or professor tells or lectures about X, Y set of things. It's teamwork. I guess some of you or many of you will know that the famous toy called Lego is kind of a plastic brick.
That's right.
And this was also developed to what I can call kind of nurture teamwork. If you take a huge pile of Lego bricks, and you can be from Kerala, you can be from Bhutan, you can be from US, you can be from Russia, and you don't perhaps have to speak each other's language. But if you just pour this kind of huge pile of Lego bricks in front of people, then they will start interacting, working together. That's called teamwork. So that's also very fundamental in what we are doing, also at the highest level, postdoc and so forth. Denmark is a paradise, sorry to say it, but a paradise if you get into Denmark, which is not that easy. So don't make too many aspirations or have too many aspirations. It can be done and it will be done. But when you start studying in Denmark, you will get a monthly allowance around, what can that be? 200,000 rupees. Which is quite a lot, sir. And that you will get every month or a kind of allowance. And then the idea is that you should study hard and should not do part-time work next to and so forth. What we are good at in Denmark, I think we are good at, let's say, freeing the talents. We don't put people into boxes. We want to nurture a kind of individual free thinking. So that's so important. And, we often say that we have to think out of the box, which is true everywhere. But often we don't think about how big or how small the box can be. I mean, there is a huge difference thinking out of a very small, narrow box and compared with a huge box. So, this is kind of attitude that we have. And another thing which I'm very proud of, and I think has been forming a very important part of modern Denmark, is the fact that 250 years ago, there was a priest, but he was also a very important educationalist. He said that everybody has a talent or more talents, and whether they are farmers or laborers, they should be allowed to study. I don't want a system, he said, I don't want a system where you have to pass examinations or anything. You just get together and you will learn a lot of things that are so basic, but also so important for daily life. So 250 years ago in Denmark, farmers were extremely poor. They were illiterate and so forth. But he said, I want to create a system where these farmers, as an example, can have some education. And there we developed a special system called high schools, special schools, which you find across Denmark, and we have a lot of international students there. I came from Japan, and there are even some Japanese who went to Denmark, and they brought back the idea to Japan, so they started the same kind of thinking. In Japan, education is a tough job, like it can be in India, in the sense that you have to pass so many examinations and so forth. But he said, this guy, Grundtvig was his name, that we need to give people the chance, opportunity to learn something. It's not about how many grades and whatever you get.
I can't but help ask you this question. This is your second stint as ambassador to India. So what is one thing, if you were to choose among the perhaps many things you like about India, is there one particular thing you'd like to talk about in terms of your one particular facet of India which you find particularly attractive, as also one particular facet which intrigues you the most about India? What would those facets be?
I don't think I will go into the sphere of politics as such, but I will I will mention one thing, and it has a little bit to do with politics or as such. When I was in India first time, during my first tenure from 2010 to 15, I followed your prime minister very closely and met him quite often. And when he became the prime minister, against all odds, I mean, all the elite of Delhi and so forth, the foreigners, the Indians, they said he has no chance whatsoever. Then he was elected. And I recall I was sitting very early in the morning on the 15th of August. And, 15th of August is a very important day in Indian history. Yeah. And normally you will come very early in the morning to the old fort in Delhi, sitting on the ramparts. And I had done that throughout all these years. But in 2014, your now prime minister took was the prime minister, and he was giving the speech. And he was not following the traditional way where Indian prime ministers would talk about all the big achievements and blah, 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 like in many other places across the world. But he spoke about sanitation, Swachh Bharat, and all these things. And I sensed, I could hear how all these people who normally would be called in for this kind of thing, that, oh, what kind of prime minister is that? He's talking about sanitation, toilets, and how to treat our servants and things like that. That came as a big, I will almost say, unpleasant surprise to many, many people. And people were really shocked that Indian prime minister, this huge, almost superpower, and then you have a prime minister who's not talking about the number of submarines or nuclear power stations and what we have achieved, but he spoke about what is important for the daily life. So based on that, when I came back, I realized that, and you don't have to be pro or against, that's not about that, but one important political tool has really emerged, are so efficient in India, that's the missions. The Swachh Bharat, the Jal Shakti Jivan and things like that. That is motivating, engaging people collectively. And talking a little bit about the pandemic that we are going through, I think the way in which you are energizing, really involving, engaging people, you need to have a vision or a mission. So that's something that I learned. I mean, India is diverse, it's huge. Culture is changing. There's huge difference from Kashmir down to Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra and West Bengal and so forth. So you need something that can really bridge all these differences. And I always say as a diplomat, India lives in 7 centuries. I mean, today you'll find parts of India that will live under what we call medieval times in Europe. Then you have other parts of India where people are living in the future, which we not even have thought of in our part of the culture. So I think that's a very important part. As to, let's say, the most negative part, I think despite the fact that a lot of poor people are moving up the development ladder, I think there is still a huge number of people who have really nothing. And how to consider them as a resource and not just a kind of problem or challenge, I think that's something that the society has to deal with. And therefore, I'm very, very interested in this new India vision, because that's talking about eradication of poverty. It's not about reducing. This is the idea that you have to eradicate poverty. And I hope whoever is in charge of that they will be successful in their endeavors.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're now getting in questions from listeners. Quite not surprisingly, there are some questions also on COVID-19. There's Rohan Rati here who writes, what would the new world order post-COVID-19 look like? Would it reverse the trend of diminishing multilateral cooperation, inter alia principally triggered by rising national sentiments globally?
Very, very good question, and I don't think there is any answer to that, or there can be many answers. I think to start with what I call the freewheeling or globalism, everything was globalized, and at least in our part of the world and some parts of India, if you had the money, you were just traveling wherever. You could go to Peru in Latin America, you could enjoy life, and if you didn't like that, then you moved on and so forth. So this kind of almost irresponsible behavior, that is disappearing. So I think we will move from globalization, unlimited globalization. It's not only about economics and politics, it's much more than that. But I think we'll move away from that towards a kind of more regionalism or nationalism. And nationalism is not per se a bad thing. It's also kind of, let's say, texture that binds together a population. Of course, it can have different profiles and things like that. What is important here is that the bigger you are, the higher potential you have, the more important a role you can play. And I'm pretty sure that India, given her size, her population, the many young generations, your technology capabilities, that India will stand out and will be a very, very important new part, an even more important part of the new global structure.
There is another question here by Roshan Mishra, who's asked several questions he has, but I'll pick one of these. He asks, is globalization one of the reasons for rapid climate emergencies and pandemics? What are the ways and options of going forward? Is globalization the villain of the piece?
I think we took for granted that the world became kind of one village. Huh? And you have a very famous saying in Sanskrit, we are one world. But I think globalization turned everything around, and then we thought we were one big village. And whether we were born in Denmark or in Mumbai, higher echelon of the society, we could do whatever we wanted to. We could fly here and there, we can move there, and we could get the same Starbucks everywhere. You could get pizza, whatever you like, or everywhere. And I think that has changed, and that will never come back again.
Okay, excellent. I also, I mean, one of the sort of issues which I think most countries have to contend with is, again, questions relating to global cooperation. So if there are one or two pointers, even from this particular episode, in terms of policy learning globally, I would think, what can we do differently and what can we do better, not just as individual countries, but collectively as a notion, there is a notion of an international community of states acting in conjunction with non-state actors and other actors as well to address some of these problems. What are the one or two elements one can pick up from this particular episode and build on in terms of doing things differently, maybe going ahead?
I think there'll be many answers to it, but from my point of view, and what I have taught my kids, I have 4 kids, and they're now adults, all of them, was to take responsibility. You cannot it's impossible no longer just to rely on whatever others will decide for you. You need to take responsibility. You need to understand how the world and our planet is a very small, sensitive place. And I mean, you can argue whether this pandemic is a nature's response to the way in which the human race has mistreated our planet. We can't expand the planet. We have to, let's say, be even more focused on what we can do internally. So we cannot, what we have lost to the outside, we have to gain from the inside. And there, I think India also has some very, very important aspects to bring to the new world. I like your yoga kind of attitude. It's something that will keep people reflecting or meditating and so forth. And I think we need to really reduce the speed, the pace of our life. It's really important. So India can help us a lot here. So I think that will be one of the important learnings and something we can bring along with us. But responsibility comes first.
Right. And I think this idea of responsibility is a running thread throughout this discussion. I think it's such an important idea.
I tell you.
I think linked to this is perhaps a notion today of, can we think of an idea like global citizenship? What is it to be a global citizen?
Yeah.
What are the nature of obligations one can expect from younger people, older people, people around us, if we are to really participate in a larger ecumeny, a larger collective? So in terms of identity, what does it take to think about an idea like global citizenship? Do you think its time has come, or do you think we're still lagging behind, that there is still some political evolution before we get to a stage where we can think about a notion of global citizenship?
Unfortunately, I think you're right, Professor, in your analysis that perhaps we haven't come that far yet. It has to come. It has to come. Because if we do not take away the learnings from this pandemic that has really spread like a wildfire, if we don't really stop up and think how to really cope with that kind of challenge, then we haven't learned anything. And you can always argue, is that the way that we should respond doing X, Y set of things? I think I know some Indians from when my daughter was attending the American Embassy School, rich Indian spoiled kids went to the American Embassy School. And some of them are from very well-known family. I will not mention the names, but some of these youngsters, 12, 13, 14 years of age, when a new iPhone was released, and they just asked, Papa, can I borrow one of your executive jets? And Papa said, yes, why not? And then these guys went to New York, queued up for the most important new Apple iPhone. And that's a stupid thing. So that has to be changed. And, I often do the following, and I don't hope Apple is too close, but I'm always very, impressed by, like this. This is the Apple logo. And this represents, in globalization, perhaps it's the most outmost well-known symbol. We all want to take a big chunk of the Apple because that brings us 450 new features extra when a new version is launched. But for me, Apple is Mother Earth, Ma. So every time stupid or young wealthy Indians or stupid young wealthy Danes are queuing up to get a new iPhone, they don't get a chunk of new technology. In fact, they take a chunk out of Mother Earth. So I hope that we'll not see this kind, or at least we'll see this kind of, tendency disappearing. And I do hope that there's the saying that if you don't change your direction, you're ending up where you're supposed to end. And India has such a huge potential that you can change your direction. You might end up same way at same end point and so forth, but please do things differently. And given the fact that 70% or a little bit more or less of your population is below 35 years of age, you have a huge, huge opportunity, but also responsibility.
No, I think this is a very important point about our lifestyles, our patterns of consumption, the current economic model, and ways in which we can think about doing things differently, even when it comes to our everyday lives. And I think the hope is that some of this will eventually contribute to a lower carbon footprint and a more sustainable world at the end of the day. Thank you. I think this has been a very enlightening conversation. It's been, to me, a truly inspiring, interesting conversation. And I'm sure everybody who was logged into this session learned a great deal about a variety of facets you talked about. It's been a true honor for us to host you. And I want to remind all viewers that this conversation will continue to be available on the Shiv Nadar Foundation's Facebook page in case you would like to come back to this another time. So this is archived for posterity, and anybody who wants to come back to it can also watch it later. Thank you very much, Ambassador Svane.
Thank you very much. It was indeed a great honor and pleasure, and I hope that Namaskar will also be a new symbol instead of the Apple symbol for the future world, where we are taking full responsibility for what we are doing and how we are doing things.
Thank you.
So, thanks very much for allowing me to address within this Shiv Nadar Foundation the line of speakers. It has been a truly great honor, and I wish you all the best. And I want to secure that all the youngsters who have been listening here, that they will never forget this kind of message, or the messages I try to pass on. Take responsibility. That's your way of living. Don't let us down. Don't let your planet, don't let Mother Ma down. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening. Thanks. That's an excellent note to end on.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you all for joining in. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.